Welcome, everybody, to episode 30 of Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Misty Winston. And today we are happy to have on the show again Danny Sjursen, who is a retired U.S. Army major. He served in Iraq and Afghanistan in the late 2000s, and he is now an anti-war activist, a writer, speaker, and podcaster at Fortress on the Hill. And today we're going to talk to him a bit about veteran suicide, PTSD, mental illness, sexual assault within the military, and any other related topics that might come up. So, Danny, thank you very much for joining us again.
Well, thanks for having me, and definitely for covering this subject, actually. Everyone wants to support the troops until they come home, a lot of times. Or they say they do, and then they don't actually address a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, so we do just want to issue, Jesse already said the subject matter we're going to be covering. If that's something that you find triggering in any way or difficult to listen to, exit now. I know that this time of year especially is particularly hard, and in the year of COVID, it's even worse. So, we just want to make sure that you're aware of what the subject matter is going to be for today, so you can make the choice for yourself. But I wanted to start off.
And we'll link to some resources, mental health and suicide resources in our show notes.
Absolutely.
In case you're feeling some sort of way, which I think all of us here understand and empathize with. So, yeah, that'll be there.
Yeah. So I wanted to start off really just kind of diving into the veteran suicide problem, epidemic, really. It's really, the numbers are pretty staggering. I mean, they say 22 a day. I think when I was looking into it, Veterans Affairs said that it's down to like 18 something for 2018 maybe. So I'm wondering if, when we had you on last time, we spoke a little bit about the culture in the military and how, you're kind of taught to think that you're above, you're better, you're stronger. Do you think that sort of mentality and that sort of culture in the military is making the issue of veteran suicide and veteran mental illness a more difficult issue to deal with?
It definitely is. It probably will for quite some time, and it was even worse 10 years ago or 5 years ago. The military is an interesting beast. Like, I think it's similar with all kinds of large bureaucracies, especially anything that's public. And if it's run by men, right, that doesn't help, which it often is. And that is that, they will apologize for, they will allow all kinds of incompetence tactically, like at what they're for. Like, you can get soldiers killed with either raw incompetence or just pure ambition, which also happens. Like, I want to get promoted, so I will be aggressive and get soldiers killed needlessly. I've literally worked for a sociopath, like an actual, probably clinical sociopath. You won't get fired for any of that. But then if you embarrass them, like if you embarrass the institution, that's what'll get you in trouble. So in other words, so they don't like people who speak out, obviously. But if a story breaks into the public eye, then it will start to get attention, right? That's what drives it. So in other words, it's a little better now, not great, but it's a little better now within the military because the suicide story was in the news a lot, in the last 10 years. And they don't want to be embarrassed. They don't like bad press. So then there was this effort to make it a priority within the military itself, within the VA. A lot of that, though, ends up being cosmetic, reactionary. It gets on all kinds of PowerPoint slides. There'll even be task forces sometimes. And there are people within the military who genuinely care. I mean, a few generals made it more of a priority than others, even guys I don't necessarily love everything about them, but there was a General Pete Chiarelli who was a big commander in Iraq during the surge and just before. And, he did prioritize it pretty early as far as other generals go. But there's definitely a culture within the military of toughness, of sort of suffering being glorified in a way. they'll say like embrace the suck is this phrase that everyone always says in the military, and like they're half serious. I mean, there's this idea that you know what, it's going to be hard, you have to struggle, and don't complain about it too much. And so I do think a lot of that got in the way, especially in the past, and it still does. It still does. And so what that means is that proactive solutions rather than the reactive to the bad press are less likely, and addressing the root causes and understanding its connection to endless war is not something that's palatable. In fact, that last part remains unpalatable for the most part because it's politicized.
Right. And I think too, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the endless wars provide a reason for existence for the military, for the arms contractors. So yeah, embrace the suck, but I would add to that, embrace the war. And I want to ask you specifically about your own experience with PTSD. And I'm wondering if you can tell us about that. You've written about it at Truth Dig. We'll link to that piece. And I know you've gone through a lot. You've had troops who are under your command who've committed suicide, and I'm wondering if you can give us your story, your personal story.
Absolutely. And obligatory toxically masculine military latent culture caveat, you know, I've struggled, and people have had it worse than me, a lot worse, right? We always have to do that, right? The obligatory, which we shouldn't. But yeah, I'm diagnosed. I mean, largely what allowed them to let me go early, basically, was that you know, diagnosed like PTSD, depression, anxiety, variety of like co-occurring. My own experience with it was actually not dissimilar to a lot of soldiers and like some of the problems that are associated with it in this culture, which is to say that I was pretty much white knuckling it from Iraq on. I mean, I was facing things like depression and anxiety and some of the more classic like PTSD symptoms. You know, one of the things I want to note is I think most veterans who suffer will recognize this as basically ringing true, which is that most people think PTSD and it's immediately like, oh, like flashbacks, you know, like there's just like certain like symptoms that are associated with like the disease, like with the condition, so that it's like that's what it is. But actually everyone suffers differently, you know. And sometimes two people can be diagnosed with PTSD and then have completely different symptoms. But I was having some of them, you know. I did have like some nightmares and stuff, and that's never been like the major thing. It was a lot more just like the depression and anxiety that would come from it. And then I was white knuckling it for years. And so the point here is I wouldn't get any help. So by mid 2007, while I'm in Iraq, like I knew something was desperately wrong with me. Like I didn't feel like myself. I mean, my world was pretty well shaken. A bunch of my guys were dead by that point, and you know, just a lot of death and stuff around me, and just fear. Like you can only be. I mean, I think one of the. I'm not a doctor, but I think that one of the things that can help cause this is, you know, you can't be terrified for your life all the time for all that long without something happening, right? It's just not good for your brain, right? And that kind of caused it. So I knew I was messed up a little bit, or I was struggling with certain symptoms. But that was like 2007. So I'm mid-Iraq tour. I didn't see a therapist or a counselor because I refuse, except for the obligatory ones, which I'll get to. Like you have to do certain ones, but it's like 15-minute sessions, like just to make sure you're not going to kill anyone else or yourself. Anyway, until 2013. So we're talking 6 years before I got into therapy. And then since then, I've stayed pretty much in for 7 years. I've actually taken it seriously. And, you know, I think part of the reason for that was I wasn't the type to judge others. I wasn't the type to think that people were weak, like my soldiers were weak if they sought help. I really believed PTSD existed and should be taken seriously for others. I did that dude thing, that like leader thing where I was like, it's very real for everybody else and they should get help, but I'm too good for this. Like I can't, you know what I mean? I can't be weak. So I mean, I didn't like articulate it that way, but that's how I was feeling. In 2013, well, in 2012, I get back from Afghanistan in the early part of that year, like February, and then I was in grad school 6 months later. I had been accepted to go back and teach, and so it was very bizarre, because I'm just back from the war, and now I'm plucked out of the military world, and you get sent to a civilian school. You don't have to wear a uniform. I wore my uniform like once in 2 years. I mean, it was a great gig, and I needed it, and it's all I ever wanted. It was the number one job that if I stayed in the military, I was going to go teach at West Point, partly because I wanted that break. Only what I didn't realize is that the rubber band snapped the minute I had free time and I was away from it. So that white knuckling kind of like just burst, and I started to not even be able to get out of bed. Now, I had never been late to anything in my life. I was so type A in the military, like hyper productive, if anything. And then suddenly I'm falling apart as a person. Like, I don't want to spend time with my wife, kids. I'd always kind of drank a lot, but it got worse, It was becoming more chronic rather than social. And it was just really, really bad. And I mean, frankly, I suffered through that it was almost a nervous breakdown, honestly, like a functioning nervous breakdown. I didn't miss my school assignments and stuff, but I was in bad shape. But I finally, like, at the behest largely of my ex-wife, I walked into just like a public treatment facility and got some help. But the reason I bring that up is, I mean, the diagnosed cases of PTSD, you guys probably have the stats or could pull them up quicker than I could, because I won't be exactly right. But, we're talking like 1 million veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen 800,000. But the point is, that's like very much tip of the iceberg, I suspect, right? In my anecdotal experience, whatever the number that is diagnosed PTSD of our veterans of these wars and past wars, that's really like the tip of the iceberg. And there's probably at least an equal number, maybe more, maybe double that are just undiagnosed, that won't seek help, don't know how, just don't feel it. So that was the case for me. Now with my soldiers, and then I'll pause and let you guys like pivot which direction you want me to focus. In Iraq, 4 of the guys in my platoon died, right, are dead. And only 2 out of those 4 in the platoon, it was a small platoon too, it was like 19 guys, only 2 of them were killed by the enemy, and then 2 took their own lives. 1 for sure, out of respect for like the family and stuff. Like the other one, there was an overdose of like prescription medication, very suspected suicide, right? So 2, in other words, 2 were killed not in the war, but I think they are, of course, casualties of the war. They should count. In other words, an equal number, which is wild, but that makes sense because in most years, way more service members, I'm talking even just on active duty, way more service members like kill themselves directly or through some sort of like accident that's fueled by a lot of like kind of suffering behavior and acting out than are killed in combat, way more. And that's always the case. I mean, even at the height of the Iraq war, like motorcycle deaths, alcohol-related deaths, and suicide like far outstripped like snipers killing Americans at a time when snipers were killing a lot of Americans, So I think that shook it for me. Like sometimes it shouldn't be this way, but oftentimes in life we're human beings, and when you see something in your face, like that's what makes you focus on the issue. And so I think seeing so many of my soldiers really just falling apart, in one way it helped me to avoid my own problems, because I was like, I have to focus on these kids that are suffering. They're my boys, all this. But it also made me really give a damn about the issue and take mental health seriously, even outside the military. So now, like my people don't see therapists is like a joke. I always will say like, my people this, my people don't ski, like all these like, but like, working class, like fairly conservative, and just like, it's just not done, right? I didn't come up in a culture where like, they think that's just for rich white ladies in the suburbs. Like they think that it's like witch doctors, for rich people. But I probably subscribed that a little bit when I was younger and stupid, but now I take it hyper seriously. I also take all kinds of trauma seriously that don't have to be related to combat, which I wish more veterans would, because sometimes veterans have this feeling, like we talked about the last time, the self-righteousness, original sin. A lot of veterans have this sense that like only combat trauma is like real trauma. Like, oh, you haven't really seen the real deal. But actually, I've like studied enough to realize that it doesn't work that way. There's not like a hierarchy.
Right. Well, I kind of want to pick up on something that you just said. You said that kind of when you got plucked out of the military life, that's sort of when it started to fall apart. And I think that that's something that's really important to speak on because and again, I'm not a soldier, I've never been in the military, so I don't know. But just in having done research for this show and just having done research in the past, it feels like a lot of the time when somebody comes home or they get out of the military, and like we talked about last time, that it's become your identity. You are a soldier. That's who you are. And so once you leave that world, not only are you, traumatized from everything that you experienced in war, but now who are you? Who are you outside of the military? And I think that that's such a critical piece of the conversation that's getting missed. We're not helping veterans come home and sort of reassimilate into civilian life. Do you find that that's kind of the case, that there's a lot of people who sort of get lost once they leave the military and that sort of exacerbates their problems?
Yes, because a lot of the military's weaknesses are also their strengths, right? Just like most human beings, like there's like a flip side to everything. And so one of the things about the military is that it really is this kind of, or it can be this like brotherhood, right? Sisterhood. It's, you're in a built-in social circle, right? We talked about this a little bit last time, how isolated you are. You have a built-in social network. You get to a unit within 3 days, like you've made best friends, and like you have people to hang out with who understand you. You have like a mission and an identity that flows from that mission. The biggest threat, like even for officers who are trying to protect themselves, because and I'll talk about this later, you get judged as an officer by like the behavior of your troops, like stuff you can't really control. So if they go out and get in trouble, it's like you're in trouble. So then like officers are more worried about getting in trouble than their soldiers sometimes. But what I mean by that is like your biggest fear, even as an officer who's being practical and trying to protect yourself, is when they have time off. Like you're scared when they go on leave even. So let alone get out of the military and lose that identity, because a lot of times it's like when you leave that safe space, even if it's a toxic space in many ways, like I said, flip sides, then that's when a lot of times folks start to manifest a lot more problems. Depression definitely kicks in. The identity factor is enormous. In the military, everyone matters in some level. Like there's like, you have this like identity and you're like lauded and focused. Even if you're a corporal, who's been in the army for like 2 years, you're in charge of some people, maybe it's 2 people or whatever, but like you have, like you're important, right? You feel like you're important. They make you feel important. They tell you to be self-important. And so then like you get out of the military, a lot of those skills and stuff don't necessarily translate. Now you're just a guy. You know what I mean? You're just a dude. And I think that that's like a hard thing for some people to swallow. Like, I was handling millions of dollars worth of equipment and this responsibility over lives. And now like, I'm just a person, which is okay. And it's not like we shouldn't be glorifying and fetishizing those military things, but we do. And so you start to believe the myth and stuff. And that is when a lot of the problems come in. So I think it is instructive that it was when I went into the civilian world that I really really fell apart. I'm kind of glad I did ultimately, because it forced me to get help. But I think that if you extrapolate from that, I was on a 2-year temporary assignment to grad school, but you extrapolate from that, now you're on the outside. You're done with the military. That loss of identity is enormous. It is enormous. It's the reason in the military we have battle buddy system, right? It can be kind of like a babysitting paternalism, but like you have to have 2 soldiers. Like if you go out to the bars, make sure you take a battle buddy, like, so there's always someone with you, watching you, who understands you. And now you're outside the military, and man, it's scary out there. I think any institution that like does your laundry for you since you were like 18, like that is just so holistic. It's like a babysitting service. When you pull someone out of that and that's all they've known oftentimes and drop them on the outside, like get ready for some action, Jack. Like it's going to be problematic. And I think that that's a huge, huge part of it.
Yeah. And you've written about this at Truth Dig. We'll link to the piece, but I want to quote from a particular piece we'll link to, in which you say, while you were in treatment, that you realized the chasm between polite society and an increasingly unrepresentative military caste is something that you'd never felt more than when you were in treatment, and there was sort of a class consciousness awakening, if you will, that you experienced. And in light of what's going on now with the push for Medicare for all, I think it's germane to talk about that and the class divisions that you didn't just see while you were serving, but you also saw it while you were seeking treatment. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So the sort of like the rough end to a once shining career, or once possibly shining career, was my final assignment. The final thing I did in the military. I retired while I was in inpatient treatment, for PTSD, for substance stuff, and to to the Army's credit, because it's socialized medicine in a good way. I mean, the TRICARE system, they paid for it. It was completely free. I did 30 days in Arizona, and it was a civilian facility. I mean, so they took the Army's healthcare, but half the people there were civilians, and half basically were military, mostly enlisted guys. And women. And I learned a lot about the female experience in the Army there too, which I'll bring up, because I never served much with females except when I was teaching West Point. And even then, not all that many. So, this was a pretty profound experience for me for a number of reasons. But like what I found out was that I knew this from scholarship. I had already written about this in my book. I had written articles about the civil military divide. And how, like, unrepresentative statistically, how, because what do I mean by that? In the military, like, if you grab a soldier out of a black box or a bag, right? The archetypal one is going to be more rural, more southern or mountain western, obviously more male. If he's in a combat unit, much more white than society at large, and much more likely to have family in the military, and also a little poorer. And so when you take that cross section, you put them in a civilian facility that is super expensive. So, I mean, I don't even remember the number, but it's like $60,000 or something like that, or something, $30,000. It was ridiculous. It's in the article, but like, and a lot of the people there paid out of pocket.
I'll just quote what you wrote in your piece. Some had Cadillac health insurance plans. A surprising number paid cash. A cool 60 grand.
Yeah, it was. So there was a lot of so the civilians tended to be wealthier. They tended to be whiter. It was a very different group, and they usually had very little connection to the military. Like, they were enjoying being around veterans, like being around serving people. So a lot of the people were there for like VA treatment, like the VA had paid, but a lot of these people were on active duty still, like I was, until like halfway through I actually retired, which was kind of weird. So like my retirement ceremony party was like at a rehab, and they were there for all kinds of things. Not everyone was there for trauma stuff. There was people there who were heroin addicts. I mean, it was everything. And I think that it became clear from the questions that a lot of the civilians were asking, and from some of the tension, not in there wasn't like fights or anything, but you could tell that both sides had a sense that they couldn't understand the other and the other couldn't understand them. And I think that that's largely true of our society in general, because as we've created a volunteer military that's basically starting to look a lot like a Praetorian Guard. It's like a family business. These guys' dads are in it, and then right down the line, and they don't live near the rest of folks. It was very clear that there was like this division to a certain extent, and I think that was a factor as well, because like we said, you leave the military and suddenly you're having more struggles, or you get time off, and now you start to reflect on what you've been through. You don't have the network there in the first place, and it was funny to see how quickly these veterans and soldiers who didn't know each other until they arrived, not a single person was from the same unit and knew each other. They just they were almost happy to be there, especially the guys who were out. The men and women who were out of the military were right back in the brotherhood, and they took solace in it. And part of it's because that's part of what treatment is, but part of it was definitely military, because the military people, they clicked with strangers so much faster with each other. And I started to realize there as well, and then I'll let you guys go in either direction, but what I started to realize was there were certain symptoms, conditions that were like common to almost all the military people. Like there, it was like, like the military big five or something I used to call it. It was like alcohol, depression, anxiety, PTSD. They all had the same symptoms. And so every morning when we would like circle up at treatment and we would do our name claim, right? You'd like say who you were, and you have to say like what you're there for, basically, like what you claim as your either symptoms or diagnoses. And like the military people, 9 out of 10 of them would like list off the same 4 or 5 things that I just mentioned. And then I also realized that suicide attempts were through the roof. I mean, of the people that were there, enormous portion of them had either attempted suicide or were seriously considering it. And then the females, almost every, like it was like had to be half that were the victim of a serious like sexual assault in the military. And then that was striking to me because, again, I had read all about military sexual assault and sexual harassment, how big of a problem it was. And I'd seen a little bit of it at West Point. But man, the numbers were just staggering. I couldn't believe that all these women had been through horrifying sexual trauma.
And I'm glad that you brought that up. That's another topic that we really wanted to talk about, because although it has been getting a bit more attention over the past, few years, it really is a very pervasive problem. Anecdotally, I have a friend from high school who I'm very good friends with, and she was in the Army National Guard. She was sexually assaulted twice. The first time she reported it, and the second time she did not, because the first time she reported it, it was not handled well at all. She was basically told to just keep her mouth shut. You're better off to just keep your mouth shut. And I think that that's a problem that a lot of women in the military face. It's not something that they want to deal with. Like you said, they don't like to be embarrassed. And, having a bunch of sexual assault happening on their watch is pretty embarrassing. So I think a lot of women have been silenced. And it's good to see that a lot of these women are coming out now. Over the past few years, it started to become more acceptable to talk about, but I feel like it's still very much being brushed under the rug. And I mean, you yourself were in the military, and you said you really had no idea how pervasive it was. So I think that it's a problem that, just has been very neglected for a very long time. Can you kind of speak to, after you realized how bad it was, can you kind of speak to, what kind of thoughts that you had, looking back on your own military career and just kind of examining the institution as a whole?
Definitely. I mean, when I went back and taught at West Point, that was really the first time that I took very seriously and personally the female experience in the military, because it was the first time that I was serving with women, but also the percentage of cadets at West Point who were female by the time I taught there in 2014 through 16 was about 25%, which is high compared to even when I was there. Maybe it was 15%. And then we forget how recently a place like the military academy even started letting women in. There was a separate women's auxiliary corps, the WACs, they called them, Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Women weren't even like really on active duty, just like other soldiers, until like the 70s. So this is all very new. And I think when some people are like, oh, why is this still a problem? Or when they say, like maybe they're complaining too much, maybe it's not that serious. My point to them is always like, there are people who still are young, who and healthy, who remember when you couldn't even go to West Point if you're a woman, who you couldn't even serve in the regular army. So this is all very new. And I shouldn't have been surprised. But being there, I got really close with my cadets. I really, really got close with many of my female cadets, and I started to realize that their stories, the pervasiveness of sexual assault there, and just harassment and just like toxic masculine culture. Because when you get close to a student, then they come and like talk to you after class or come to your office and they start to share their stories with you and stuff. I started to see the same patterns with my female cadets, and they hadn't even been out in like the regular force yet in most cases. And this whole thing is being kind of modeled there. I'll say this, for example. When I taught there, I started to feel really guilty about the way I had spoken about and a little bit treated women when I was a cadet. And I started to feel horrible about it. And I had been one of the, it's not a good excuse, I'd been one of the nicer guys. Like I was never really cruel to anybody. I didn't like haze the female cadets extra. I wasn't overtly mean to anyone, but I kind of fell into the culture there at the time. Now we're talking like 2001 through 2005. This is not that long ago. You know, when I was a cadet, I kind of dismissed the females a little bit. Like I was nice to them, but I was like, they're not like as real as us. And like, I'll never, I would say stuff like, I would never like date one. I'm like cool enough guy that I could date a real girl, right? That's what we would say, right? I mean, there's language that we used to use, like pejoratives for female cadets, that now is illegal. Like if you say this word, and it's not even that, it doesn't seem like that bad of a word, it's trow. That's what they would refer to female cadets as. It's like, oh man, I can't believe you slept with a trow. Like, ugh, who does that? It's short for trousers because they have to wear trousers, And there's other like stuff that goes along with that. There's other little pejorative slang. Now that word is like forbidden, which is fine, but it doesn't solve the problem, right? It's like a typical like military cosmetic change where it's like, okay, just don't say the word anymore. It's like, well, we still act horribly. It's like, well, we can't. What are you going to do about that? That's always going on, But that was a big deal, and so I think I was a little bit dismissive of them. I didn't really get close to the female cadets, and then when I was teaching, I was like, oh my God, like what was I? How could I have been like that? And of course, people were way worse than me, which showed me. Now I remember this as well. One little like more West Point anecdote. And the reason I use West Point is not only because it's the only place I serve with females, but it's also kind of this like factory for the future of the Army. So what happens there matters. It sets standards. 1980 was the first class to graduate females. Okay, so they went in 1977 or 76, and then graduated in 1980. The culture stuff that we're talking about. The class of 1979, I guess, whatever the class right before was, they took a picture for the yearbook. And you take these things called old core photos, which is like a sepia tone, like picture in front of the granite walls. It's like meant to look really old. Everyone takes one, right? And then you usually take it with your group, like whatever your group is, like your company, your team, whatever, right? Famously, the black females at West Point, when I was teaching there, did like a fist salute, and it actually got in the newspaper. So this thing goes on all the time. Well, that class, all like the male graduates, they took a big picture, and they were all holding different like sporting balls, like footballs, soccer balls, basketballs, and then they took it, and it was like in the yearbook. Why? Because they're the last class with balls, right? So that's like the minor stuff. Here's the bigger stuff. My TAC officer, when I was a senior at West Point, I was the cadet company commander, so I was in charge of a lot, and I would talk to her all the time. She shared this with me. She graduated in 1993, and she was in company B1, and she had told me that by the time she graduated, she was either like the first or one of the first classes that graduated a female from company B1. There's 36 companies at West Point. I think there's more now. And so you live in the barracks with this group. That's who trains you. That's who hazes you, right? All that stuff. You work together. So all the other companies were graduating females since 1980. B1 didn't. The B1 Barbarians, I believe, is their name. But what everyone called them back then was the boys of B1. You're not allowed to say that anymore either at West Point. Well, B1 decided in like 1980 or 1977 when the women came in, they got together and said, no women are graduating from this company. Like, if the Army wants to change the rule and West Point wants to change the rule, then sure, but not us. Like, we're such a tough company. So what they did was they hazed all the women out for years, right? And this didn't get really addressed. And that was the nickname, the boys of B1.
Sorry, how would they do that, the hazing? What were some of the methods? Because I think it's important to put that into context.
So I'm gonna tell one anecdote about it, but in general, the hazing, which was a lot worse back then than it is now, and it was even worse. It was worse when I was there than it is for the kids now. But like, it's still there. It's physical, right? Like making them do physical exercises to exhaustion and muscle failure. In some cases it got physical, like people got hit and stuff, but that's more rare. Even then, that was more rare, and it's a lot of mental. So just like shutting them off, taking away any privileges, almost silencing them where no one will speak to you, right? That's what they used to do to the black cadets back in the day, right? They would silence you, meaning that no one would speak to you. But just torture, that's torture. Like, we're social animals. General Benjamin O. Davis, who was the first black West Point general, graduated like 1930, he was silenced for 4 years. And he didn't even want to then they just named barracks after him, by the way. he didn't even like want to come back to West Point for like West Point events, like even when he was a general, because he never really forgave the place, right? Because his peers just like silenced him. So there was a lot of that. Well, this woman, my captain at the time, she was in B1, and she did graduate. And the way that they have made it work eventually was they scrambled everybody basically. So they emptied the company out and brought all new people in from the different companies because like they had to break this culture. And what she said was she went to intramurals one day, like as you do in the afternoon. And when she came back, they had like hazed her and her. She was the only one I think who made it. They like hazed all the women terribly. They were just trying to get them to quit because that's what they do, because you got to keep up the boys of B1. She came back from intramurals one time. She opened up like her sock drawer to like get her stuff out, you know, like to get ready to go take a shower. And like dozens of men clearly had ejaculated into her like underwear and sock drawer. So again, like a message of sorts. And so that it could go as far as that, you know.
Yeah.
It wasn't that long ago. We're talking about like the early 90s now. So that kind of culture of exclusion towards the women, it shouldn't surprise us that there's a sexual angle to it, like the, you know, thing in the sock drawer, but also in terms of harassment and eventually assault. And so this is that's an epidemic. I mean, it is an absolute epidemic. If you look at statistics at the military academies, if you look at the statistics overseas, when there's not a lot of access to other women, right? The rates are through the roof. And it's basically what we're doing is we're victimizing our own before the enemy even gets a chance. And it destroys the human talent resources. It wastes. So even practically, it's a terrible thing, because it ruins people and doesn't, you know, welcome in all different kinds of voices and a variety and diversity. But and then of course it destroys people's lives.
Yeah, and
isn't it 1 in 4 women will report at some point being a victim of sexual harassment? And that's just those that report. I guarantee you that number is much higher, because like I said, even with my friend, she reported the first one. She learned very quickly that reporting the second one was a useless endeavor. So I think that that is a very low number. And 1 in 4 is, I mean, that's a massive statistic. I mean, that's, if you like, you know, stand with, as a woman, me standing with 3 of my friends, 1 in 4, that's, I mean, that's a huge thing. And it's really, it's not something that I think surprises me, because I think societally, that's kind of where we're at. Culturally, that's where we're at. Women are still, you know, seen as lesser than, or they're objectified. I mean, we see it every day. It's very pervasive throughout culture in general. But then you throw women into a totally male-dominated environment, and they're sitting ducks, and that's terrifying. I can't imagine, you know, being in that situation as a woman. That's scary.
Yeah, and it translates internationally, and what I mean by that is, I feel like I'm bringing him up every episode now, but Robert wrote about this. He went to Mutla Ridge in Iraq, which is a large part of where the so-called Highway of Death occurred, if I'm not mistaken. And even if you go there now, I believe there's still wreckage from both Iraqi soldiers and civilians some Kuwaiti civilians who were killed. And you can still see the burnt out remnants of tanks, which apparently had their cannons turned backward, which, Danny, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a sign of, you know, sort of like a white flag, if you will. Like, we're not in combat mode. We're going back to Iraq, even though we did just plunder Kuwait and rape so many of its women.
Right. Yeah.
He went back there after, I forget when it was exactly. I think it was soon after it had happened, and he was looking at the wreckage, and there were documents buried in the sand from Saddam's regime. And one of the things he noticed and pointed out was that on a lot of the burnt out tanks and other military vehicles, Iraqi military vehicles, the American troops had spray painted jokes or sayings or clever things, but almost all of them, he said, had a reference to sex and death, as if those two things as a soldier just naturally come together in your consciousness, if that makes sense. And I found that very striking and also very disturbing in this massacre scene that, that was added to it. And I think that, that was back in 91. And I think it speaks to the longevity problem of the culture we're talking about. So I just wanted to cite that as an example. And
well, I mean, George Carlin has a really great bit from that time called like Rockets and Penises in the Persian Gulf, where he makes jokes about how, like, not only are all these weapons like phallic symbols, but that, there is a connection between like sex and war, and that the cultures collide. And it can be cosmetic stuff, but it's instructive, like, nicknaming your tanks like all kinds of like sexual oriented, like aggressive things, like that people will like stencil on the side of their tanks, like it's they give them names and stuff. And then I've read entire articles about like the pinup girls and stuff that were spray painted on the bombers that were massacring German and Japanese women and children. Right, that there's always been this connection. Part of it is just because it is a bit of a boys' club, and it used to be completely a boys' club. And I think if we're going to be honest about ourselves as a species, sex and violence and the combination of the two they're deep inside like human beings. That doesn't excuse it, but we've developed a sort of culture over time where violence, whether it's killing of your fellow man or woman and rape, those two are linked. I mean, there are armies that wage war by rape. It's usually associated with like Africa, but that's not an African thing. Like that's what happened all across Europe, like during the 30 Years' War, and then in the more recent 30 Years' War, which is the conglomeration of World War I and World War II, which should really be seen that way. I mean, so that the fact that rape as a weapon of war shocks us, I'm like, well, then you didn't read that many books, I guess, because it's always been connected. And I mean, I noticed it from the start. There's a lot of weird homoeroticism that goes on in the military, my experience as well. It's just really, it's disturbing. And I think this dismissal of women is wrong on its merits, but it's also so backward and counterproductive too. And of course, unfair. In Iraq, I was in the cavalry, right? And we don't ride, our horses are like iron horses now, but we're reconnaissance basically, right? Scouts. And we even wear like the cowboy Stetson hat from the old cavalry movies, and we wear spurs, and we go on like a special hazing physical event, and if you pass it, you earn your spurs, like that phrase. I mean, we literally dress like Native American genocidaires, at parties. Like I was in cavalry units. That's what we do. And I took my Stetson's right over here, I mean? So like, I'm not above it. Like it's a big part, but, like the old cavalry, there's always that phrase of like, hey, go to the sound of the guns. Like, here comes the cavalry. Like, you just respond to whatever's around. It is part of like the culture. So on more than one occasion, but one really stands out, I was just on like a random patrol doing nothing, trying not to get blown up in Baghdad. And then a bomb hit another patrol that was just in the area, and we were the first responders. And a female military policeman was devastatingly wounded, and my soldiers pulled her out, and obviously I was right there and saw the aftermath of it. And so it's like the exclusion culture of women and the dismissal of women is just totally belied by the fact that they're dying for their country, or for what they think is their country, just as much, right? I mean, obviously there's more men because there's more men in the military, but like women do die in combat. So this whole idea that like, oh, women shouldn't be in combat units because women, shouldn't be fighting in combat. It's like, well, they already were, right? They always were, but especially in the post 9/11 wars where it's attacks on convoys and stuff. So you don't have to be an infantryman to be killed. That really just struck me. And I thought differently after that as well.
Yeah, I think that rape has always been used as a tool of the oppressor. I mean, we've talked about this with Liza Black when we did our historical episode on the missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic. And, you know, like she said, rape and domestic violence wasn't a thing in Indigenous cultures until the white man showed up and that was introduced to their culture. So I think that that's something that we really have to reckon with as a country specifically, but I mean, just in general as a species, because it's not just the United States that uses it. But, you know, it is something that I think really does get sort of, you know, overlooked. And I think that that's also just another way of dismissing women. And, you know, it's just another way of keeping women oppressed and in their place. And, you know, don't talk about that. We don't care. And so that's really unfortunate. But I think that it's, you know, it's something that I think, you know, over the past few years, it's been encouraging to see it get talked about a little bit more. But it still feels like it's so, like there's so much work to do, and not just about, you know, sexual violence in the military, but just the way women are treated in general in society. And I think that, you know, you can't fix one without the other. You know, if we don't fix culturally what's wrong inside of us, there's always going to be violence against women. So, I mean, it's unfortunate that it is so pervasive in the military structure. I think a lot of that's probably just due to the fact that, like you said, a lot of things are brushed under the rug to avoid embarrassment. And so it's easier to get away with in the military. And I think that that's probably well known. You know, women, and it's scary as a woman to come forward. I mean, if you look at, I mean, just Tara Reid, for example, when she came forward about what happened to her with Joe Biden, she has been vilified, raked over the coals. They have, you know, gone back and dug into her life and tried to find everything imaginable that they can hold against her and make her look bad and destroy her character. And that's what happens. I mean, that we've seen that time and time and time again. So it's very difficult as a woman to even have the courage to come forward. And those who do are incredibly brave and should be supported. And, you know, it's just really, it's really terrifying. I have 2 daughters, so it's terrifying that in the year 2020, we're still dealing with this stuff. So yeah, I mean, I hope that the military and, you know, we as a society can figure out a way to try to deal with that issue. And like you said, it is very much ingrained in us as a human species. So it's a difficult thing to tackle, but it's something we really need to work on. But I did. Oh, go ahead.
Can I add something on that real quick? Yeah, and it may actually lead into what you want to talk about. But to show how ingrained the culture is, I think images, just like anecdotes, can be really instructive. Go back and look at the photos from Abu Ghraib, right? The prisoner abuse. It was highly sexualized stuff in many cases, like putting them naked in like positions that were sexual, especially homosexual positions, because these were male prisoners. And it's so ingrained in the culture that, you know, there's a lot of victims in that picture, and obviously the real victims are the prisoners. But one of the victims I always feel is that Lindy England woman, who's the famous one with like the thumbs up and stuff, right, holding the leashes. I mean, here's a female soldier like exhibiting a lot of these aspects, right, of just massive like sexualizing of war and toxic masculinity and abuse. And I'm not obviating her responsibility. I don't know what her heart is. I can't imagine having done that. But that was, to me, that shook me a little, like looking at those photos and being like, Jesus, like, because they do. I mean, if you want to fit in, a lot of women have this, like, that you got to kind of join the boys club or be a victim, or they'll still probably be a victim. But, you know, there's that sense of it. And it really ruins everybody. Everyone ends up being tainted by it. And the second and third order effects are enormous. So I'll wait to totally jump into it, but there is a public policy angle to some of this about whether the military can really be trusted internally to handle things like sexual assault investigations. And I can talk about why at some point if you want, because there's some really interesting things. And no one agreed with me on this. Like my brother officers thought I was a lunatic and like a
I
feminist.
would really actually like for you to talk about that, because I'm always looking for solutions. And so, yeah, if you want to dive into that and just kind of, because it's kind of like, when the cops investigate themselves, and they're like, yeah, we didn't do anything wrong. It's kind of the same way I feel about the military. The military investigating themselves to find fault is very laughable to me. I think it definitely needs to come from an outside source.
Or when Israel investigates itself.
Right. Ridiculous. Right. So, yeah, I mean, can you talk a little bit about what policy-wise can be done?
Right now, generally the system has always been that the military police is its own. We have our own legal system, the UCMJ. There are two types of punishment: administrative and criminal. Administrative punishment is handled completely in-house, right? Just the chain of command, meaning the sergeants and then up to the officers have varying levels of authority. They're kind of judge, jury. And even on the criminal side, they have an enormous amount of influence in investigations and punishment. Most people don't realize that, like a captain in charge of a company, like when I was a captain, I had an enormous amount of authority to like punish kids. I could take part of their pay every month for like anything. I mean, if they don't come to formations and stuff. I mean, there's no jury, there's no witness for the defense. I mean, they can request the trial by jury, but they never do it. Because then the punishments could even go up, right? It's kind of like forcing you to plea out. But the chain of command with no legal training to speak of, right? I went to West Point, which means I had to take a semester of law, half of which was on military law. So that meant that I had about 2 months worth of classes on this when I was 20. And because I went to West Point, that means I had infinitely more training than the 90% of the officers who don't go to West Point, who don't take a single law class, right? You might get a PowerPoint briefing on your new authorities. So that's who's handling a lot of this. The military fiercely holds on to, the officer corps especially, that power, because it's all about what they call good order and discipline. You're almost like the captain of a ship, you can like marry people at sea sort of thing. I mean, there really is a lot of power when you're within the military, and they fiercely guard it, because they believe that if there's external oversight or external systems, especially civilians involved, then it's going to undercut their authority with their soldiers and will be a detriment to good order and discipline. That's the buzzword they're always going to throw around to you when, like Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, on this issue, she's been pretty good. She's been one of the people who's been pushing for civilian oversight, civilian investigations when it comes to sexual assault. Mountains of evidence proving empirically what you've been describing anecdotally and what I've experienced anecdotally to some extent myself, that these investigations are themselves toxic and victim blame and create a scenario where people don't want to come forward. The reason that happens, or one of the reasons that happens, is because you're investigating in-house. You end up sort of not wanting to lose, say, a good soldier, male, who has been accused of sexual assault, because that might throw off kind of the tenuous culture imbalance. Maybe you lose a talented guy if he's higher ranking than her, which he usually is, right? Just like in any job, right? There's that power and authority that ends up manifesting sexually. It could quote hurt the unit, right? And also everybody's friends, and also most people come out of a pretty toxic masculine culture when they come into the military, which is called America, but also a certain subset of America that's inclined to the military tends to have more of that, if we're going to be frank. Then the instinct, the reflex, is to blame the victim. And so what ends up happening is what you described earlier. When women report sexual assault, especially, I mean, it's getting a little better now because there's focus on it, just like the suicide, but it's still bad. A lot of times the commanders will be like, they'll punish the victim of a sexual assault, the accuser, for being, say, drunk and underage when it happened, right? Because that punishment is immediate while the investigation goes on, and a lot of times doesn't actually go anywhere anyway. But like, hey, but what were you doing, drinking when you're only, 19 or something like that, right? They end up getting punished for that.
It's not the rape, it's the Budweiser.
Right. That's the problem. Is like, it really is a manifestation of that whole, like, well, if you weren't wearing such sexy clothes culture, that goes on. If a charismatic sergeant who's like a natural leader gets accused and is the perpetrator of a sexual assault, it is remarkable how quickly not only his subordinate soldiers, not only his brother sergeants, but his officer chain of command, which relies on him for the effectiveness of their units, rally behind him. Mm-hmm. And let's just also be clear, again, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm pretty sure I'm right on this and have read some stuff about it. Let's also be clear that a lot of times, victimizers, right, people who target folks for things like sexual assault tend to be sort of charismatic type A figures. And so a lot of times it is that guy that is the perpetrator or is being accused, and you see people kind of line up behind him. So what Gillibrand and a lot of people besides her want to do is kind of create some civilian oversight that looks at these units with more of a disinterested view, right? They're not involved, because the formula right now is a formula for victims to be blamed. There are better officers than others. Some take it really seriously and do the right thing, but the system itself is built to be a block from victims actually being protected or getting justice. My friends, I would say this, when I was a company commander, I had no females, but we all like to pontificate on the issues in the world. We would have lunch together, all the captains, at least once a week, just bullshitting, whatever, talking, and these kind of issues would come up. And I had said, this is like 2011 and 12, I made the mistake one day at lunch saying, like, you know what, like, I've been hearing, because it was really just starting then. I said, I've been hearing some talk about maybe like these sexual assault investigations might need to like have an external oversight. Mm-hmm. And these are good, like these were guys that I liked, and I think were better than average, right? Because I kind of like they were people I chose to be around largely. Also company commanders, they freaked out. I mean, like, nobody agreed with me. Everyone was like, what? How could they? No. How could you want to have us take our authority away? Are you crazy? But then I realized these are the same guys who were against gays in the military because they said, oh, it's going to destroy our unit cohesion. Well, that's the same thing they said about women in the military, same thing they said about African Americans in the military. And so one day on that subject, because it does relate to this sexual assault stuff, because it's the culture, we had an argument about gays in the military, which was getting ready to happen, whether that was going to have the effect they said it would have, which was a destroy.
We wanted to ask you about that as well, but
I'm great minds, there's no script, listeners. Like, this is happening organically, and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's like ESPN or something,
right? So, when we had the argument about whether gays in the military would do what they said it would do, which is destroy cohesion and just break the army. First of all, I said, like, I'll bet you a $10 scratch-off ticket it won't. And of course, I was easily vindicated because nothing happened. Like, there hasn't even been a blip. We changed the rule, and guess what? Everything's fine, except we're losing wars we shouldn't fight. But, like, it didn't change the military. But when they said that, they were making their arguments about why gays shouldn't be in the military, and it's the similar argument to what they were making about sexual assault, about women. What I did was I actually went back and I grabbed quotes from military officers at different periods in time arguing against bringing African Americans into the military, and then arguing against bringing women to the military from across about 100 years. I blacked out where it said women, black, or gay. I mixed them all up, and I played a game with them, and I said, read a quote, and I said, who was that said about? Mm-hmm. And then no one could pick it out because the rhetoric and the arguments were exactly the same. So that's kind of the culture you're up against with the officers in particular, and the senior officers who tend to be older and maler and whiter. Is they make these same good order and discipline false arguments, and they fight it. And what they are is a reflection of that broader culture.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to dial back to that you mentioned earlier is the youth of the people who are involved, how young they actually are, versus not people such as yourself, but older commanders, if you will, like James Mattis, for example. And we hear these names, Mattis, Petraeus, I'm forgetting his name, but the JSOC guy who was
McChrystal and McRaven, both. You have to have an MC at the start of your name to work for JSOC. That's the rule.
Yeah. So you've obviously been involved in the younger side of it, and we always hear these names like McRaven, McChrystal, Petraeus, etc. who are these people? Where do they come from? And what kind of lever do they have on sort of controlling or containing the military culture we've been talking about?
This is important.
Because I don't ever hear of what Mattis has accomplished, for example, or even as we were talking last time, Barry McCaffrey, right? I think he was a Vietnam vet.
Yeah, he was severely wounded in Vietnam.
Yeah, but there's this sort of this like supreme council of these military leaders, these old men who are making decisions for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of younger people, and it's never really discussed like who they are, what they've done. It's just Mad Dog Mattis, for example. Right. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that age gap between these sort of senior citizen generals and then, kids who are in their 20s being sent off to fight these forever wars.
This is like a super important question that no one ever asks and no one really ever answers, because these generals tend to get a pass from society. They don't even get a critical look. They don't even get investigated because they're heroes and they have stars on their chest and they wear a uniform, and we love our military, especially our generals. But really, there are some just inconvenient truths that we have to say about their kind of class, right? They're like core group, their generation. Not all of them are monsters, although a surprising number are. Not all of them are monsters, but this still rings true and has ramifications. Okay, who are the generals who led the war on terror? Who are the generals, the famous high-level generals that I served under? They fit a certain profile. Again, archetype. They graduated from a military academy, usually. Generals are so about 10 to 15% of officers, I think, go to West Point or the Naval Academy or whatever, right? But an enormous percent, maybe half, of the generals did. Okay, they stay in longer. There's still a bit of a clique. They call us ring knockers, right? For knocking our West Point rings. In other words, we like stick together, and there's like a culture, and we pull each other up. But the West Point still runs the Army, right? So they tend to be graduates of a military academy. They tend to have graduated after Vietnam. Okay, too late to have served in Vietnam, but only just. They graduated between about 1973 and 1980, most of them. So they missed Vietnam. They never really saw any serious combat, most of them at all, or at least until they were generals, when they were too high up to see any real combat. They are male and they are white, almost across the board, right? Again, we're doing the grab bag thing, disproportionately so. And remember what I just said. They graduated from like West Point or the Naval Academy between 1973 and 1980. What does that mean? Well, reflecting back on how it all connects, none of these guys even went to school with females. When they were cadets and young officers, women couldn't even go to West Point. And they're charged with making decisions for a much younger new generation on things like sexual assault at the military academy, sexual assault in the military. This doesn't make all of them bad guys. It means that as a group, as a generation, there's like serious blocks there. It's like putting whiter, maler, more military culture, dads who were in the military, graduates who were old enough that when they were in school and when they were coming up in the military, there weren't even any women there, in charge of dealing with a, epidemic of sexual related attacks, bias, all the things we've talked about, is insane in a way. And the thought that doesn't need civilian oversight in the little like subculture tribe of the military, which is already too insular, as we talked about in the last episode, it's insane. It is insane. In terms of what they've done, they've lost a whole lot of wars. We laud these guys, and they're 0-50 between them.
Right.
I mean, they're like the New York Islanders were in hockey when I was a kid. Like, these guys haven't won anything. Like the Mets are better. And like, that's not even all their fault either, because they were put in mostly unwinnable wars, but we laud them for accomplishments they don't have. My generation of younger officers, and we have our problems too, there was a lot of resentment of our senior officers, our colonels and our generals when we were in Iraq, especially, and in Afghanistan. I'll tell you why. Because almost none of our senior officers, the guys making the calls that get people killed or not, had ever been in combat themselves when they were young officers. Again, not their fault. It's a matter of timing. They were too late for Vietnam, so they spent the first 20, 25 years in the military. At best, maybe they saw like 8 minutes of combat in the Persian Gulf War or something. You know, in other words, there weren't a lot of major wars, which is a good thing, sort of. But they hadn't seen a lot of serious combat, whereas the lieutenants and the captains of my generation, who were actually the ones that fight, you know, the only officers that tend to fight, we sort of resented them a little bit. And there was a colonel, my last point on this, there's a colonel, he's still alive, his name is Paul Yangling. He teaches history now. I think he's just like a social studies teacher. Me and him, I don't agree with this guy on everything politically, especially domestic. But he's pretty critical of the wars, and he was very critical of the generals. When he was a lieutenant colonel in Iraq, right before I was there, he wrote an article in the Armed Forces Journal, I believe. It was a military publication, like we have our own little like periodicals. His name is Paul Yangling, and he writes an article called "A Failure of Generalship" or something. And this is not done. Okay, this guy was a battalion commander in Iraq, and he writes this article. And what he basically argued was that the generals are terrible strategists. They're failing. They're incompetent. Like, even if this is an unwinnable war, which he didn't really broach, like they're running it poorly. They're blowing this thing. And at the end, he said something that it became very famous within the military culture. Like, people know this phrase. He said, as it stands today, and it's about this lack of accountability we talked about for generals. As it stands today, a private who loses his weapon stands to get in more trouble than a general who loses a war. And it really resonated. Paul did not become a general, as you might not be surprised to hear.
Yeah, shocking.
And it set off an enormous debate within the officer corps about whether what he did was right or wrong, and whether he was right or not. And so in that sense, he had an effect. But what he speaks to there, I think, does relate to some of these things we're talking about, because the generals have almost no accountability.
Yeah, and it's as if these cosmetic factors have taken, if not all, so much precedence over the substance of what the military is supposed to ostensibly achieve, right? With regard to winning the war. It's, like you said, a private who doesn't have his gun gets in more trouble than somebody like Barry McCaffrey, who, after the first Gulf War was essentially over, went on massacring Iraqi soldiers and civilians. And it's like the minutia is more important than what the mission is supposed to be, I guess you could say. And I think that's sort of a reflection too of our current political system. It's about the minutia and not the larger picture. And not to say that I have it figured out or I have the answers, but it's pretty clear from the discourse that I've been engaging with that, especially with people who are advocating for Biden, they don't get it. It's cosmetic. It's minutia. It's little things. It's cult of personality. It's not about what this guy did, what his history is. And
well, I think that's also very indicative of the kind of the justice system. I mean, there are a set of laws for the regular people, and then there's a complete lack of laws for people at the top. I mean, politicians, I mean, they're all crooks and criminals, every single one of them. I mean, if we dug into any one of their financial records or any of those things, they would be really should be in prison. And I think it's kind of the same way in the military as well. Once you get to a certain level, you are protected institutionally. You can get away with almost anything because there is this divide, judicially between the people and the 1%. And that's, I mean, it's just, that is how the United States has allowed itself to kind of form, into this completely ridiculous system where, the people are treated one way, and then those in power are treated a completely different way. And just look at what Joe Biden. I mean, he is credibly accused of sexually assaulting someone, and he just got elected president.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Like, that's
Yeah,
insane.
you can, yeah, and we just had a president who, you know,
Was also credibly accused multiple times.
Right.
I mean, we had two white men who have been credibly accused of sexual assault running for the highest office in the land in 2020, and then we think like, oh, we're so woke now, like things are so modern, like why are these women complaining? Like that's insanity.
Yes.
Those are our choices.
And to see one side, you know, I cannot believe we elected Trump. He was credibly accused of sexually assaulting somebody. Then defend Joe Biden because it's their team is very depressing. It shouldn't matter who's on your team. I'm more worried about the victims of the sexual assault. I don't care who did it or what party they're in. That shouldn't matter. And it's very depressing to see that sort of team mentality, you know, come up.
Yeah, and never Trumpism has absolutely become a social pathology. I talked to a number of people who are vehemently anti-Trump and who voted for Biden, and I'd bring up these points that we were just talking about, and the constant response is, well, it's not Trump. We need to get Trump out, as if Trump is Darth Vader or Satan. I like Satan. Sorry, Lucifer. But it's things get so co-opted and corrupted by cult of personality, and you know, I think that's not just with regard to politicians, but with military officials as well. And you almost feel this this obligation to fet them, to worship them, to respect them, and it's complete bullshit.
You know, this connects to another seamless sort of transition that relates. You know, one of the more disturbing things that's going on with the military right now and American culture and the militarization of it is sort of like the politicization of the generals. Now, generals have always been political. The military's always been political. This whole idea that it's an apolitical institution, they fiercely guard that myth. It's always been a myth, but it's gotten really bad. It's gotten really overt. And it's gotten to this weird place where now Democrats, right, mainstream established Democrats, suddenly love the generals more than the Republicans and love like the CIA, which they used to attack, right? Some of these hosts used to like attack the CIA like 10 years ago, like Rachel. And like now it's like they're all heroes because they're spies. And it's like, did you forget about like all like the coups and like torture and poisoning of people that we did, well, like that you used to not like, right? But part of it is that when the generals were perceived to be anti-Trump, which some were, right, retired and active, to like not be bullish on Trump, then they were really embraced by the mainstream left. This is dangerous. And this is something that I suspect is going to have blowback, right? There's always unintended consequences that they may not like so much. But like when the Democrats have decided, and they've always done this, right, throughout history, but when Democrats decide to wrap themselves in the American flag and the military and the generals and stuff, there's a few problems with it. Number one, it's like an overt militarization of the culture, but these aren't necessarily the allies you want or need if you're a progressive, okay? Like there are some progressive military officers, not many. And that's when what they say they're anti-war or they're anti-this or anti-that, really they're anti-Trump. And we saw it with Bush and Obama, right? It's like, oh, I'm anti-war. No, you were anti-Bush because then Obama came in and you went dormant. Well, this goes on with like the generals too. They don't get questioned. They get this free pass in general because our culture adulates them. You know, American culture is really becoming like Lee Greenwood's song, you know, like Proud to be an American from like the Reagan 80s. Like really, I mean, we should laugh at that song, and that's who we are now instead. And so the generals were already getting a free pass, but now they're getting a free pass from all sides, right? Except for like the alt left and sort of like the libertarian paleo types, right? Everybody loves the generals so much, and now liberals love them a whole lot because, well, maybe they don't like Trump. They signed a letter, 89 of them, right? And the Washington Post saying Trump's bad, and like Trump is bad,
Protecting
but there are
us.
a lot of war criminals on that list who signed that. There are a lot of people with credible accusations of war crimes,
Yeah.
And the list is full of people who couldn't win a war and could have resigned but didn't when they were in the wars. And I say that as someone who didn't resign, and didn't speak out soon enough. So I'm not, not omitting myself here. But these guys, they're not great allies. And the last thing I'll say about that I think is sort of important about these generals is they, like other corporate heads, but especially in the military because it's like such a dangerous business, they become like cartoonized caricatures of a human being or what a general is supposed to be. And sometimes there's a lack of substance. I remember when I was in Iraq, there was a division commander. Can't remember his name or which division, but I can look it up. Actually, I was trying to look it up just now. He used to walk around with a baseball bat tucked into his body armor everywhere he went. Now, why would he do that? Was he killing Iraqis with a baseball bat in hand-to-hand combat? Of course not. Of course not. He drove in convoys safer than anybody. He had his own personal security detachment. He showed up in a combat zone to visit a base, visit some captain who's like, oh shit, the general's coming. That makes my life hard. I used to hate that, right? For an hour, tourism sort of like that. It's the nature of the job, but like generals don't command from the front anymore. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's like when L. Paul Bremer stepped onto Iraqi soil with his combat boots on, but he was wearing a fucking suit above that.
Yeah, what it is it was a prop. He was carrying around a prop to show he's a tough guy, masculine. See how all this connects? Like, it's serious. Like, I couldn't stand that. I don't like generals like that. My favorite boss, who is a general himself now, right? I'm not going to use his name. He hated those generals when he was a colonel, and now that he's a general, he makes fun of them, because he's a good dude. Like, he really is. And there are some good ones, and even the good ones in the military, they reject that crap, but it goes on. Patton used to walk around with pearl-handled pistols everywhere he went. Everyone's heard that story, and of course, he actually used his pearl-handled pistols to shoot at close range two of Pancho Villa's lieutenants during the punitive expedition in Mexico, and then proceed to put the bodies on the hood of a Jeep and drive them like deers back to the headquarters to brag to General Pershing, who ran the First World War. That's a story everyone should know. But I'm sorry for the diversion.
Did you just write a piece about that? Sorry to interrupt.
I think I mentioned that story in a piece actually not too long ago. The piece wasn't specifically on the punitive expedition, but I definitely mentioned the anecdote.
Okay.
But so the point is, this has always been going on. There's some theater to leadership, and sometimes it goes to a very absurd logical conclusion, like the general with the baseball bat or the pearl-handled pistols. What ends up happening, though, in this is that they're actually exuding a lot of the sort of toxic behavior at the top that may be cosmetic, but when it filters down, it is a little bit of a methinks the lady doth protest too much moment when then they suddenly act like, oh my God, there's a sexual assault problem in my division. It's like, dude, you strut around like a cartoon character. And they give speeches that are super violent and stuff. People say, well, the military is a violent business. Well, there was a colonel named Colonel Steele. Last anecdote, but I think people think these are interesting, hopefully. Colonel Steele was the company commander of the Rangers in Black Hawk Down. Mm-hmm. Famously played in the movie. The guy who plays the football player, the ex-football player captain, the bald head. It's a real guy, Mike Steele.
Oh.
Yeah, real douchebag. There's a great New Yorker, I believe it's New Yorker or Harper's thing done on him. A bunch of his soldiers committed war crimes, executed like an old man and some other people, maybe more rapes, right?
And this was
say again?
This was in Somalia.
No. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me clarify. When he was in Somalia, he was the captain of those Rangers. He was the commander of that mission that went bad that got a movie made about it. Right. He was captain them. Fast forward 10 years, 15 years, right? 2006-ish. He's now a brigade commander in charge of 5,000 soldiers in the 101st Airborne Division. And he's a colonel, full colonel. His brigade commits a bunch of war crimes. Like some of the soldiers at the lower level, like sergeants and privates, commit this. And there's a bit of an investigation, and it hurts his career. But nothing ever really happens to the guy because there's very rarely any real punishment for these generals or even these senior colonels. Well, when they went back and started, and there are so many other colonels that I can list off who this is true for, by the way. When they went back and started doing any investigations, they looked at his command environment. They call it like command culture or whatever, command climate. And it turns out that he had been giving speeches. I think one of them is on YouTube, basically telling his soldiers in not exactly so many words not to take prisoners. That he doesn't want captives. He wants to hear about how many you killed. You know, these aggressive sort of speeches. And there were other things about him, like he would make all the officers on his staff and in his brigade have like fights, like wrestling matches with each other at like officer professional development affairs. Like he would make them fight. People got hurt. Like people got hospitalized. I heard a story that I can't confirm through another corroboration about a captain who went to his unit, but from a credible source, like a guy I trust, who when you get to a new unit as a junior officer, a lot of times you get to meet the boss on the way in, like an 5 minutes like meeting or whatever. And he said that this dude had a like heavy, like maybe 80-pound dumbbells in the corner of his room and in his office. And when the captain or whatever went in and was like, "Hey, sir, I'm here to report that I'm coming to your unit and nice to meet you," he was like, "Go over there and curl those, do bicep curls, see how many you can do." Like that was the way he tested his like officers, like to see if they were sufficiently manly, even though like whether they're competent or not and effective is like all cerebral. Like how many friggin' bicep curls you can do with how much weight isn't going to determine, especially for an officer, like whether he's effective. But that filters down. And so then when you have war crimes being committed, is it directly the responsibility of the colonel? We could argue about that. But if you don't think that they create the climate, which circles back to the stuff like sexual assault, suicide epidemics, torture and stuff that goes on, hazing, why are we surprised, right? Why are we surprised? And oh, by the way, Steele, when did he didn't go to West Point, but when did he graduate college? Well, like mid-'80s. So women are really only just filtering in. So same, right?
Yeah. I think that generational divide is probably a huge part of the problem. I mean, like we said earlier, there's this, old guard of these old white dudes who are far removed from any combat or struggle or anything like that. And they're making decisions for 18, 19, 20-year-old kids in a completely different military environment. The military has changed. It has evolved. I mean, like you said, there are now women who are in combat, and it's a completely different animal. And these guys who are controlling everything have no idea what's happening in real world military these days. So it's a big problem. I don't know how to fix it. I mean, that's why I was so interested in hearing solutions, because it seems like a very overwhelming problem to tackle.
And part of the problem too is that they don't know history. They don't read history. They don't, for example, recognize, or maybe they do and don't care, that no imperial power has ever been able to conquer Afghanistan, for example. It's always been the death zone of an imperial power who's tried to invade the British, now the US, and they're just so out of time. And as you said, Danny, they're like cartoons. They're like caricatures of what they're supposed to be. And I guess that's a good segue into, now that it's Christmas time and there are caricatures of everything everywhere, I want to ask you about this piece you wrote about Jimmy Stewart. Mm-hmm. It's on Truthdig. We'll link to it. It's titled Jimmy Stewart's Not So Wonderful Life with PTSD. And I don't want to bring it up just because of Jimmy Stewart. I want to bring it up because of a point that you make, and I'll quote what you wrote in the piece, that it's unthinkable that military service today can include so many high-profile soldiers is an indictment of the prevailing national culture. And you also mentioned Pat Tillman, who was a high-profile figure and whose death was originally whitewashed, and now we know what happened. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that, Jimmy Stewart served and then went on to make It's a Wonderful Life, which, as you wrote in your piece, he, in that role, channels a lot of the actual trauma he went through. Can you speak about that? Because I think a lot of the American polis regard the military as sort of, yes, there are individuals in there, these are human beings, but it's still sort of this nebulous mass because, look, Jimmy Stewart's not serving in there. Or take your celebrity of choice, for example. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that, how sort of you know, the sort of difference, the value difference, arbitrary value difference between, just what you would call a grunt, for example, and then somebody like Jimmy Stewart, a celebrity, or somebody with a high profile serving, why that makes a difference nowadays.
One of the ways to make sure that there's a massive civil military divide, one way to isolate the military and create like this subculture, right? This kind of Praetorian Guard. One of the fastest ways to do it is for the famous and the wealthy citizens to opt out of service, right? When the famous and the wealthy, when celebrity and political leaders and wealthy business leaders, when they and their children opt out and no longer serve, that drives a huge wedge. Because what they're essentially saying is my kids have something better to do. And this isn't actually just like a call to bring back the draft. I think there's so many issues with that. I'm of two minds about it. But what it does do is it isolates the military. It makes them unrepresentative of the whole and a little bit easier to just like, characterize and kind of, even if you laud them, you end up kind of like not thinking about them a lot. They don't live near the big cities, and like people in our neighborhood, in my, you say like, I'm not talking about me, but like people who live in some gated communities, like, well, my people don't go into the military. Like, I don't even have an occasion to see a soldier except when he's on the 50-yard line. And so then I'm clapping for, again, a cartoon soldier to me, because it's not real. In World War II, partly because there was a draft, but actually because the culture was a little bit different, good and bad, most of them actually volunteered. Most people were talking about they weren't drafted. Of course, they knew they would be. The sons of prominent politicians all served in these wars. The Sulzberger family or whatever, that's the New York Times, their kids served. All the Kennedy boys, right, until Ted, served. John F. Kennedy was a big hero in the Pacific War. Bobby enlisted in the Navy, right, which his family didn't want him to do during the war because he was, college and everything, but he wanted to get in the fight before the war ended. And John's older brother, Joe, named after the father, who was the one that was supposed to be president, was killed. He was shot down, right, as a bomber or fighter pilot. The serving president in World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had 4 sons in the military, one of whom won a Silver Star. These guys weren't in staff positions; they were in combat. Like, they wanted frontline combat. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt's sons, right, served in World War I, and one of them was killed. And it broke Teddy Roosevelt. Like, it shattered his life. And then, and he was shot down flying early planes behind German lines. And then his other son ended up committing suicide in the Second World War. He was like at Normandy. He was like one of the big heroes of the Normandy invasion. He was he may have been the first general to step ashore. He was like in combat. He later kills himself. Mm. So and that's the politicians. The actors, the baseball players. Ted Williams hit 511 home runs or 512 home runs. He missed 6 years, I believe, prime playing time in his career in 2 wars, where he was a fighter or a bomber pilot in the Marines in World War II and Korea. Maybe he hit 650 home runs, right? Who knows? And these guys, he didn't have to stay in the military and go to Korea, right? He could have gotten out. His wingman in Korea right? The wingman of Ted Williams, the famous Boston Red Sox slugger, was John Glenn, who became astronaut John Glenn. You can't make these stories up. Jimmy Stewart, and a lot of them were like infantrymen and stuff. A lot of the names I mentioned happened to be flyers, but back then it was very dangerous to be in the Air Force. Like they had the highest casualty rates. Jimmy Stewart was like the leading man. He was like A-list actor playing all these leading roles before the war. And he joins, and he could have gotten out of it probably. And then once he joined, they tried to make him do what Reagan did, which is just like do pictures, like do movies for the military, like propaganda films and stuff, and visit the troops, right? Because that big heroic American Reagan, yeah, who could have done what Jimmy Stewart did. Let's keep this in mind. Like, I'm not necessarily saying that your willingness to go fight and die makes you a better person, but it does say certain things about where you think you are in the pecking order. And so then later on, when you're this big chicken hawk who's in favor of all these wars and wraps up the flag, it does raise questions. Because Reagan could have done what Jimmy Stewart did, which is this. He said, no, thank you. I don't want to do any of that. I want to fly bombers in combat. Okay. That's a bold move when the highest casualty rate in the entire U.S. military at the time were bomber crews. They were dying at exorbitant rates. The reason the book Catch-22, the famous novel, is written about those bomber crews, about how they can't even get to the 25 mission limit without dying. They were like, some of these units taking 100% casualties, which means, everyone is killed or wounded before a certain amount of time, and they have to refill all the ranks statistically. Stewart is on a bunch of bombing raids, understanding, by the way, that there are human beings under these bombs, right? So, like, let's remember that the victims aren't just the people getting the PTSD. It's who they're dropping bombs on, mostly civilians in Germany and Italy, and even worse in Japan. But,
he dropped bombs over Bremen, I think you wrote.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just bring that up. It's interesting to me on a personal level because my father is Ukrainian and he was born in Czechoslovakia when it was still a country. And this was as his family was leaving the Soviet Union, going west, and they spent a bunch of time in Bremen. This was post World War II. He was born in 1947, but that has, I think you can understand, a particular resonance with me. Sure. Yeah, just a fun fact from that piece, which we'll link to.
And Stewart took it seriously, to his credit. I mean, I'm not saying that changes the fact that our policy of mass civilian bombing was one of the most important things America's ever done. But Stewart was affected by the bombs he was dropping on people. It actually informed his trauma and like caused some of his serious, not then called PTSD, because it did bother him a lot, actually. And he talked about it. He lost massive numbers of people on his under his command. In one mission, 13 of his bombers with 10-man crews were shot down, and they all died. 130 men in one mission, and that was just one time. He actually goes a little nuts, as they would call it. He breaks eventually, and then he goes back to flying again. So I'm not demeaning this man's courage, but he went what they called flak happy back then. Because flak was what they would shoot, like the anti-aircraft guns would shoot up. It would burst, and they called that flak.
Yeah.
He kind of lost it and had to be grounded. Like they had to force him to sit out missions because he was kind of losing it. He was just the trauma and the symptoms. And so he's devastatingly affected by this. He loses all this weight. In the piece, there's a link to a fairly famous picture of him in 1941 and then 1945. So when he starts in the army and when he leaves, and he looks like he aged at least 15 years. He was already skinny. He lost incredible amount of weight. His mother and father didn't recognize him or cried when he got home. They were like, oh my God, who is this man? It really affected him. And so It's a Wonderful Life is the first movie he does after the war. And he channels a lot of the energy of his own trauma. And he was actually pretty frank about, ahead of his time in a way, in that he actually did speak about what he was going through a bit. and was honest about the troubles he was having. And in fact, it also kind of became an open and secret in Hollywood that Jimmy Stewart's like not okay. He's like a burnout vet, and it was actually affecting his ability to get roles. So I mean, I wrote that piece I think last Christmas, and the reason that I did was because I think it did two things. Number one, it showed that like something's awry when all the privileged people in our society have opted out of service. And look, let me show you, it hasn't always been this way. Look, Jimmy Stewart, and then all these others. But also, like, the fact that he was suffering, I was hoping would show people that this is a long-term thing that's always been a problem, but also it could happen to you, kind of, like it humanizes it with a famous person. My last point on this about the divide: in the 1990s, military sociologist, very famous, Charles Moscos. It's what he did for his whole life. He's a scholar. He studied like military cultures, as like a sociologist. And he always cited this poll that was done. They went around in the 90s. They were having trouble with recruitment, as they always are on and off. And they did a poll of recruiting sergeants and officers in charge of recruiting stations across the Army. And they polled these guys. And they said, if you had to choose, would you rather like your funding be doubled or have Chelsea Clinton enlist in the military? And like almost to a man, they said it would be more helpful to us if Chelsea Clinton would join the military. Mm-hmm. The point being, when people see the famous and the prominent serve, it sends a certain message about what kind of society we are. Because the society we found out we really are is one that sends economic draftees from poorer and more rural backgrounds to do our fighting for us and to do the killing in our name for us, while we sit on the sidelines, cheer a little, pick up a chuck once if we're really generous, and then essentially ignore them when they come home broken.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it really is how they hide war. I mean, it's no different than how we used to, there used to be actual war reporting and on the ground reporting and pictures and video and films of the coffins coming home and all of those things. We don't see that anymore. And that's because war is not popular. And so they have to hide it from the American people as much as they can. And they have to mythologize it. And if you have like an Elvis Presley or whatever serving in the military, and he or she happens to get killed in combat, that's a problem for them public relations wise, and that makes it harder for them to sell those wars. So I mean, I think it's a very strategic thing, and like you said, it's just turned into an economic draft where it's now they're just preying on these poor kids from terrible neighborhoods who that's their only option, that's all that they have. And it's this really really nefarious playbook that they're working from. And it's, I mean, and just to speak on the photograph of Jimmy Stewart before war and after, there's actually when you said that, I just looked it up because I remembered looking at it. There's a photographer did like a series of pictures of soldiers from before they left for war and then after. And I'm probably going to mispronounce their first name, Lolage Snow, but it's called We Are the Not Dead. And anybody who's interested should go check that out, because it's very telling to look at the faces of these young men and women, before they go in and then when they come home. It's really something to see how it changes them physically. And that's really just a manifestation of how it's changed them emotionally and psychologically. But yeah, it's definitely something worth taking a look at for sure. But you have been, as always, incredibly generous with your time. I know we're a little over. Sorry about that. Again, we do this with you every time.
And just in terms of art that relates to war or anti-war, and going back to the flak we were recently discussing, there's a great poem. I'm sure a lot of viewers know it, but if you don't, it's The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner by Randall Jarrell. It's a 5-line poem that some have in the poetry world have called perfect, and he uses that word in there. That's actually the first time I ever heard that word and learned about it, which was in high school, where we had quite a good English program. But I wanted to ask you before we let you go, Danny, you're a writer, and I think language is such an important aspect of what we're talking about, whether it pertains to veteran suicides or mental illness or sexual assault in the military. And you can see that the language is used to manipulate. For example, it's no longer I forget what the previous name was, but it's essentially now the Warrior's Code, the sort of like handbook you get when you enter the military. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit before we sign off, about the language aspect of it. Again, especially coming from your perspective as not just a vet, but a writer as well.
Always look to the language, right? Per Hitchens. Yeah. Always look to the language. It will give away the culture every time, right? It just will, whether it's euphemism or evasion or whatever the purpose of it is. It is going to tell you about what's going on in society that you don't necessarily want to say outright. And one of the things that's happening is this professionalization of the military has turned into a Praetorian Guard. It has turned into like a class, a caste, caste of soldier. And it's a family business, and it's divided from the citizenry. And that's not the design of the army in a republic. It's not even the design of like the founders, to the extent that they agreed. Citizen soldier was important, right? That was the idea. In a republic, in a democracy, you have to have a citizen soldiery. Scared of standing armies, There's a reason that one of the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights says you can't quarter soldiers in the citizens' houses, right? It's because the British did that. They made the people of Boston have to let soldiers stay in their homes. And it was such a big fear. Now it seems anachronistic to us, but at the time it was big because they were scared to death of standing armies. In fact, what the founders believed largely, for all their flaws, was that you can't stay a republic if you even have a standing army. They were arguing about whether even having an army full time all the time, whether there's a war or not, would end up basically being toxic for the health of the republic and eventually turn into an empire. Of course, that's what happened, and for more reasons than just that. But this was a really important thing. So the citizen soldier myth, and to some extent real concept, it died after the draft went away completely. It had always been flawed. It had never been perfect. When we got rid of the draft in 73, it was gone. It's gone. And it becomes this, a warrior caste. And the warrior phrase is really important because I didn't get a memo about this. No one asked my opinion. But sometime when I was in the military, everything started changing to use the word warrior.
Thanks to Donald Rumsfeld.
Right. No, I mean, really, 6 degrees to Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld if anything bad has ever happened in the world. You know what I mean? It's not, you don't even need 6, right?
Yeah.
But it pervaded the culture. And so the soldier's creed that we all had to memorize, turned into the warrior's creed. The primary leader development course, PLDC, which was the school that sergeants went to, or guys who were about to make get their sergeant stripes, they went to this training, the PLDC training, and they changed from that to the warrior leader course. And that sounds like a small thing, but it's not, because what it's really saying is you're a warrior class. You're not serving your country temporarily while you're young in a time of crisis. You're a professional warrior. That's what you are. You're a different class of human and a different class of citizen. And this is what started to happen. And if you Google that warrior thing, there's more than just the two that I mentioned. All kinds of things started getting called, warrior this, warrior that. The language gives it away because that had been going on for a long time already. It had been going on for a long time already. And when Nixon ended the draft, it was Nixon, first of all, who ended the draft. That's a problem. Think about that. Nixon didn't end the draft because he was a nice guy and he thought it was wrong that we were sending these poor kids to Vietnam. He was bombing civilians in Vietnam at higher rates than ever before. He said
and Laos,
doing it, right? If Nixon did it, it can't be good. All right. In other words, except for the EPA, maybe. But Nixon did it because he wanted to undercut the anti-war movement. He said to his advisors, if we take this draft thing away, then most of these kids in the streets protesting the war, they'll quit caring about Vietnamese people. And you know what the sad part is? He was right. Mm-hmm. Largely, not completely. It worked. It worked. And the reason that the anti-war movement is weak today, one of the main reasons is kind of that. Mothers aren't scared enough. And I don't want them to be scared at all. But mothers aren't scared any longer that their kids might have to go fight in one of these wars. Unless they want to, or unless they come from a culture where that's normal, like the kind of family where that happens a lot, or the region that happens a lot. And it's just really problematic. And again, last point, because I guess I probably really should go, when the rich opt out, okay, then the political class inevitably opts out. There's a lot of talk right now about like the Yale Club in the Biden administration, you know, like the Yale boys and stuff. Well, it's true though, right? Like these Ivy League types go into politics, populate bipartisan administrations, and then manage the wars that they wouldn't have even dreamed of serving in. Wouldn't even cross their mind. Like it wasn't even in their life circle that would have been a thing to do, right? It's guys like Jake Sullivan. So these become the chicken hawks. It wasn't always thus, though. It wasn't always thus. In World War II, 400 something Harvard graduates died in that war, which is only a few less than West Point, which is an army factory. Most of them volunteered. And I'm sure a lot of them were real terrible guys. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't want to hang out with most of these like blue blood Harvard types from back then. But they did think that the wealthy and professional sort of like prominent class should serve. And there was a draft that would have made them eventually serve anyway, because there weren't really as many deferments in World War II. No, Harvard Ivy League graduates have not been killed in these wars. There was a point where there were like maybe 2 graduates of Princeton who had served in, Iraq and Afghanistan. There are articles all about this. They just opted out. But that's who then runs the wars. It's bizarre. It's a formula for forever war. It's part of the formula. Yeah. And it's a sick culture, and we should talk more about it. And that's why I'm ranting, and that's why I'm going over.
Well, just as a counter example to that, of somebody who comes from sort of an Ivy League background, who hasn't ended up that way, and who's actually, I think, a very good writer, someone I've met, and has actually given me some generous writing advice. Danny, you may know him, the writer Phil Cly.
I do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like his work.
Yeah, he's, I think, a good counterexample to what you were just talking about. And not to keep you, but before we let you go, I wanted to ask you about, in this discussion we're having, we're sort of assuming that we need a military or some sort of national protective force. And I'm wondering, as somebody who served in the military, who comes from that culture, how you feel about the necessity of that, because, we're having this discussion and the underlying assumption is that the military is there and it's always going to be there, and it's a matter of reforming it, etc., sort of like the police or ICE, for example. And I just wanted to get your opinion on that, as somebody who has the experience with that culture.
I mean, I'm increasingly circumspect about that, about the underlying assumption. I haven't come down hard on yes or no there should be any professional standing force, but I think it's an increasingly dubious assumption. It's one that I'm more willing to challenge than ever before, and I think that the historian's eye helps here again, because that assumption that we all have, that even the left comes from usually on these, just the assumption that of course there has to be like this military, and probably a big one. It wasn't always the case. It really wasn't. I mean, again, the people, everyone's uncle has a slaveholding founding father's bio on their nightstand at all times. It's obligatory. It's the only way to get into the white male club. I don't know if you guys know that. Like, it's a big deal, like, of a certain age. But I mean, in other words, even the founders that they laud, they weren't so sure that there needed to be a standing army. Mm-hmm. They weren't so sure at all, especially the Jeffersonian types. They thought this was it. Like, this would destroy the republic. And that really you could and should take the calculated risk, of not having it and then having to raise it in a crisis if something were to happen, like if there really was a threat. There's always that phrase that like everything looks like a nail if all you have is hammers. But I think it goes a step further. I'm not good with money. Like I spend, right? I'm not a saver. And, my dad used to always say like,
you're in that club too?
Oh yeah, I'm the worst. Like if I've got money, like I'm going to find some woman who doesn't even have sex with me to give it to, like my mom or my exes. But like as a generous thing, or just like a waitress, and it's a problem with me. I realize it's a mental block, but I'm working on it. I'll bring it up in therapy again. No, but like in other words, my dad always used to say, "I can't give you any cash because that's going to be burning a hole in your pocket," right? Everyone's heard that phrase. It applies though to when you have this massive, strong, cock-blocked and ready to rock, literally military at all times, then you're going to use it. Mm-hmm. You're going to use it. Like you'll find threats that aren't really threats. You'll drum them up for a lot of reasons. I mean, the different branches of the service want to remain relevant. They want to protect their funding. The military-industrial complex wants to make money, but there's also a cultural component to it. Like you just have it, you're going to use it. We have not fought very many wars in our history that needed to be fought. Less than 10% of the wars that we fought, any consensus of scholars would tell you didn't need to be fought. People who study it, people who care. Mm-hmm. That should give us pause. Shouldn't it? And so I think what it does is it raises a lot of issues. Countries like Costa Rica don't have one. There are some examples, and there's a debate as to, why they remain safe and free. And if it's because they're protected by some, nuclear umbrella or like, I actually reject a lot of that. I think a lot of that is kind of patronizing and misunderstands human behavior and ascribes influence to the United States that it doesn't actually have or it shouldn't. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I think that we should take a really hard look at the size of our military, the professionalization of it, the permanence of it. At the very least, I would come out and say I'm essentially for have the whole thing. Just have it. Just cut it in half. Give the money, Robin Hood. I don't care. Give the money to whoever needs it. Like my dream, if I was in charge of like, any sort of agency I would take that money, I would put it into like sacks, like old fashioned sacks that you'd like steal in the Middle Ages. And then I'd use the old military bombers after painting them like pink and like fly over poor neighborhoods and just like throw like the sacks, out. Anyway, I think that's an important thing to
fund healthcare or something, like, we could just have healthcare, or we could fund education, or there's so many things we could be doing with that money other than blowing people up.
And I think that's such an important point, and I think a topic for a larger discussion. But the military budget, which we hear it's around $750 billion, but that's not the true amount. It's probably closer to $1 trillion. There's actually a really good Nation piece on this from 2019, I believe, which we can link to in the show notes, but it really breaks down how there are so many ancillary expenses on top of, what we hear is I think it's 754 billion now.
Yeah,
that's what they just voted on, which they voted on with no debate, no discussion, but we can't even get our vote for Medicare for all.
Yeah, and I think I just to, that's important in what we're discussing now too, because, money in this capitalist age we live in equals power, and $1 trillion budget, you can get away with a lot with that, and that's what the military seems to be able to do, is get away with murder, both literally and figuratively. So, but again, yeah, that's a whole other discussion we could have for.
We'll have Danny back again for that, because we could talk to you forever, man. We really could.
Yeah, you tell me the subject and the time, and I'm definitely interested, and I appreciate you having me on. I will end with one of my sound bites. The military branches always have like slogans. Armies was like "Be all you can be," and then it was like "Army strong," and the Navy's is "Global force for good," which is my favorite euphemism. But I think that if we're being honest about this conversation, that we should definitely do an episode on, the U.S. armed forces in general, like the U.S. military, like if this meme hasn't been made already, like it should be their slogan. It should just be a picture of the Pentagon and say, the Department of Defense. And then below it would say, this is why you can't have nice things. That should be the slogan. And that's what we should be describing, because part of the reason we can't have humane things is because we throw $1 trillion a year at the military.
Yeah, and that includes Medicare for all, and I think that's what's sorely missing from the discussion. I think there are a lot of people out there who are doing really good work to push for it, but it's still sorely lacking from the conversation. It's the elephant in the room that, for some reason or another, a lot of people won't touch, even as they're campaigning for, I think, what is a humane thing like Medicare for all. But again, that's another discussion we can have. Hopefully on another episode. So, Danny, thank you so much for joining us again. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and hopefully it didn't seem like too much of a labyrinth we went down, and had a trajectory to it. But everybody who's watching, our guest today has been Danny Sjursen. He's a retired U.S. Army major who served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He's taught history at West Point, and he's now an anti-war activist. He's the author of 2 books, The Ghost Riders of Baghdad, is that correct? Mm-hmm. And Patriotic Dissent, which came out this past October. And he also co-hosts the Fortress on a Hill podcast, which I recommend you listen to and follow. And Danny, thanks again for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, absolutely. And never worry about the labyrinth of subjects. I'm a tangent taking human form. So I love it. And let's do it again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So much.
Great. Bye.